Let me start by saying this. I never thought my life would turn into some twisted episode of Dateline. My name is LILA HARPER, and until recently, I was just your average suburban wife trying to figure out how to keep plants alive while juggling a full-time job as a graphic designer. Life wasn't perfect, but it was okay. Or so I told myself. My husband, well, let's call him Ethan for now, was the kind of guy who could charm his way into anyone's good graces. He had that polished real estate developer vibe. Tailored suits, expensive watch, and a smile that made you forget he hadn't answered your question. We've been married for 5 years, and honestly, I should have seen the cracks forming. But love, or maybe denial, is blind, isn't it? It all started one Tuesday evening when Ethan didn't come home from work. At first, I shrugged it off. Maybe traffic? A late meeting. But then came the phone call, a blocked number, and a voice on the other end whispering cryptic warnings about Ethan's business dealings. That's when the little hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. You know those moments where you realize everything you thought you knew might be a lie? Yeah, that hit me like a freight train over the next few days. Ethan's absence stretched from hours to days, and every excuse I tried to make for him sounded weaker than the last. I called his office. They said they hadn't seen him since Monday. His friends? They were clueless too. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. I confided in my best friend, Rachel Monroe, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that misery loves company. Rachel listened patiently as I rambled about Ethan's odd behavior over the past few months, the canceled vacations, the weird bank statements showing withdrawals I didn't recognize, the way he flinched whenever I brought up finances. She gave me the pep talk I needed. Lila, trust your gut. If something feels off, dig deeper. So I did. And boy, did I wish I hadn't. Here's the kicker. Ethan didn't just leave, he left me holding the bag. Literally. When I finally mustered the courage to go through his study, something I rarely ventured into, I found a stack of unopened envelopes addressed to me. Each one contained legal documents transferring joint assets out of our names. Our house, our savings accounts, even the car we bought together. It was like he'd planned this escape down to the smallest detail. And then there was the email. Oh, the email. Buried deep in his inbox was a message confirming a private jet reservation to Miami under a fake name. Fake name. Like, who does that? I sat there staring at the screen, feeling a mix of anger, betrayal, and sheer disbelief. How could someone I loved, someone I shared my life with, do this to me? But here's the thing about being blindsided. It forces you to wake up. And waking up hurt more than I ever imagined. The second anonymous call came late at night, just as I was about to crawl into bed after another sleepless day. This time, the voice on the other end was clearer, almost frantic. Your husband isn't who you think he is, they said. He's involved in something big, bigger than you can imagine. Meet me tomorrow at noon outside the Starbucks on Main Street if you want answers. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to chalk it up to paranoia or some elaborate prank. But curiosity got the better of me. What if they were telling the truth? What if Ethan really was mixed up in something dangerous? So, against every rational instinct screaming inside my head, I agreed to meet them. When I arrived at Starbucks, I half expected to see some shady character lurking in a hoodie. Instead, I was greeted by a tall, broad-shouldered man flashing an FBI badge. His name was Agent Michael Torres, and his presence immediately put me on edge. Wasn't this supposed to be some random tipster? Why was the FBI involved? Turns out, Ethan wasn't just dodging marital responsibilities. He was wanted for questioning in connection with a massive Ponzi scheme linked to his real estate empire. Millions of dollars funneled through shell companies, investors swindled out of their life savings, and somehow, I'd been living blissfully unaware in the middle of it all. Sitting across from Agent Torres in a dingy diner booth, I felt like I was watching my life unravel in slow motion. Every word he spoke chipped away at the illusion I'd built around Ethan, the illusion of security, stability, love. According to Torres, Ethan had been planning his exit strategy for months, using our marriage as a cover for his illegal activities. And me, I was collateral damage. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying memories in my mind, searching for signs I'd missed. The excuses, the evasions, it all made sense now. But the worst part, he hadn't even bothered to divorce me before running off. No closure, no explanation, just silence. By the time Torres finished explaining the scope of Ethan's crimes, I was furious. Not just at Ethan, but at myself for letting him manipulate me for so long. I decided then and there that I wouldn't let him get away with it. If he thought he could disappear without consequences, he was dead wrong. Torres offered me a deal, helped them track Ethan down, and they'd ensure I wasn't implicated in any of his schemes. Desperate times call for desperate measures, right? So, armed with nothing but determination and a growing sense of justice, I teamed up with the FBI to bring my lying, cheating ex-husband to justice. Let me tell you something about working with the FBI. It's not nearly as glamorous as it looks on TV. Sure, Agent Torres had all the gadgets and resources, but that didn't mean my life suddenly became some action-packed spy thriller. No, most of our investigation involved sitting in cars for hours, staring at buildings I didn't care about, and eating gas station snacks because we were too busy to stop for real food. Our first lead took us to Miami, or rather, it took me there with Torres trailing behind like a shadow. Apparently, Ethan had been spotted hanging out with some sketchy characters in South Beach before hopping on that private jet to God knows where. The goal was simple: follow the breadcrumbs and see where they led. Easy enough, right? Wrong. Miami was hot, like oppressive humidity pressing down on your soul kind of hot, and crowded. Everywhere I looked, people seemed to be living their best lives, while mine felt like it was falling apart. But hey, at least I got to upgrade my wardrobe. Nothing says undercover investigator like oversized sunglasses and a floppy hat, am I right? Things really started heating up when we met Marcus Reed. Now, Marcus wasn't exactly what you'd call trustworthy. He was one of Ethan's former business partners who'd apparently grown a conscience, or maybe he just wanted immunity from prosecution. Either way, he agreed to help us, for a price. Meeting Marcus felt like stepping into a noir film. We sat in a dimly lit bar downtown, the kind of place where everyone whispers even though no one's listening. Marcus slid a manila envelope across the table toward me, his hands shaking slightly. Inside were documents detailing Ethan's offshore accounts, fake identities, and plans to flee to the Cayman Islands. But here's the thing about dealing with criminals. Even reformed ones, they don't stay quiet for long. By the time we left the bar, Marcus was already looking over his shoulder, convinced someone was following him. Turns out he was right. Someone was watching us. The ambush happened 2 days later. We were parked outside a warehouse where Ethan supposedly stored some of his assets, a bunch of luxury cars and yachts, according to Marcus. It was supposed to be a routine stakeout, but nothing about this whole mess had been routine so far. Suddenly, headlights blinded us as a black SUV screeched to a halt inches from our bumper. 3 men jumped out, guns drawn, shouting orders I couldn't process through the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Torres reacted instantly, grabbing me by the arm and shoving me down onto the floorboard. Shots rang out, glass shattered, and chaos erupted around us. Somehow, we managed to escape, thanks to Tara's quick thinking and a conveniently placed shortcut through an alleyway. As we sped away, heart pounding and breath ragged, I realized just how deep this rabbit hole went. These weren't ordinary criminals, they were professionals, and they weren't afraid to kill anyone who stood in their way, including me. After the ambush, Torres tried to talk me out of continuing. "Lila," he said, his voice firm but tinged with concern, "you've done more than anyone could ask. Let us handle the rest." But I couldn't walk away. Not now, not after everything I'd been through. Ethan had taken everything from me, and I wasn't about to let him win. So despite Torres' protests, I booked a flight to the Cayman Islands. My plan: pose as a wealthy investor interested in Ethan's latest venture. It was risky, sure, but desperation has a way of sharpening your focus. If I could get close enough to gather evidence, recordings, emails, anything, we might finally have enough to bring him down. The night before my departure, I stared at myself in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back. Gone was the naive wife who believed in fairy tales. In her place stood someone stronger, angrier, and determined to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone Ethan had hurt along the way. Arriving in the Cayman Islands felt surreal. Palm trees swayed gently in the breeze, turquoise waters sparkled under the sun, and everywhere I turned, luxury oozed from every pore. This was Ethan's playground, the the perfect hideaway for someone trying to erase their past. I checked into a 5-star resort under a fake name, courtesy of the FBI, and spent the next few days blending in with the elite crowd. Champagne brunches, yacht parties, and endless small talk about stocks and real estate. It was exhausting but necessary. Slowly, I worked my way into Ethan's inner circle, charming his associates and dropping hints about my supposed fortune. Finally, the invitation came, a private dinner at Ethan's villa overlooking the ocean. My stomach churned with nerves as I stepped inside, unsure whether I'd find answers or danger waiting for me. Seeing Ethan again was like taking a punch to the gut. 5 years of memories flooded back. All the laughter, the fights, the promises he'd broken. For a moment, I almost forgot why I was there. Almost. He greeted me warmly, acting like we were old friends reconnecting after years apart. "Lila," he said, his smile dripping with false sincerity. "What a pleasant surprise. What brings you here?" I forced myself to play along, pretending to be intrigued by his new life. Over dinner, he bragged about his successes, careful to omit any mention of his criminal activities. But beneath the surface, I could see the cracks, the arrogance, the greed, the emptiness that drove him to betray everyone around him. It wasn't until dessert that I finally confronted him. I waited until we were alone on the balcony, the sound of waves crashing below masking our conversation. "Why, Ethan?" I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. "Why did you leave me without a divorce? Without even saying goodbye?" At first, he tried to deflect, spinning lies about how hard things had been and how he thought I'd be better off without him. But I pressed harder, refusing to let him wiggle free. Eventually, the truth spilled out. He never loved me. I was a means to an end, a pawn in his game of deception. The weight of his words hit me like a ton of bricks. How do you recover from knowing someone used you so completely? But instead of breaking down, I stood tall, recording every word on my phone hidden in my purse. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about making sure he paid for everything he'd done. Of course, Ethan eventually caught on. His eyes narrowed as he pieced together what I was doing, and before I knew it, his charming facade vanished, replaced by cold fury. "You think you're smarter than me," he sneered, grabbing my wrist tightly enough to bruise. Panic surged through me, but I refused to show fear. "You underestimated me," I shot back, meeting his gaze head-on. "And now you're going to pay." Just as he signaled for his guards to detain me, chaos erupted outside. Gunshots echoed through the air, followed by shouts and the unmistakable sound of authorities storming the villa. Torres and his team had arrived, timing their raid perfectly to save me from certain disaster. Watching Ethan being handcuffed and led away was surreal. He struggled against the agents holding him, screaming denials and threats that fell on deaf ears. I stood there, frozen. As reality sank in, it was over. After months of chasing shadows, risking my life, and confronting my deepest fears, it was finally done. As they shoved him into the back of a police van, our eyes met one last time. There was no remorse in his expression, only hatred. And yet, strangely, I felt free. For the first time in years, I wasn't tied to him, not legally, emotionally, or otherwise. Back in the U.S., the fallout was swift and brutal. Ethan's arrest made national headlines, exposing the full extent of his crimes. Investors came forward, sharing stories of how he'd ruined their lives, while former employees revealed the toxic culture he'd cultivated within his company. It was ugly, messy, and painful, but also cathartic. For me, though, the hardest part was testifying in court, sitting on the witness stand, recounting every lie, every betrayal, every moment of pain he'd inflicted. It was like reliving the nightmare all over again. But when the jury returned a guilty verdict, sentencing him to 25 years in prison, I allowed myself to breathe for the first time in what felt like forever. After the trial, life didn't magically return to normal, not that I even knew what normal looked like anymore. The whirlwind of emotions, anger, relief, sadness, left me feeling raw, like an open wound exposed to the elements. But slowly, piece by piece, I began rebuilding my life. The first thing I did was sell the house Ethan and I had shared. It wasn't easy. Every room held memories, good and bad, but staying there felt suffocating. Instead, I bought a cozy little apartment downtown, a fresh start in a space untainted by his presence. I painted the walls soft gray, filled it with plants, some of which actually survived, and made it mine. Then came the financial cleanup. Thanks to the FBI's investigation, most of Ethan's assets were seized, but he'd still managed to leave me with a mountain of debt. So, I picked up extra freelance projects, worked late nights, and cut expenses to the bone. It wasn't glamorous, but each payment I made toward clearing my name felt like reclaiming a tiny piece of myself. One day, while grabbing coffee at my favorite cafe, I met James Bennett. He was tall, with warm brown eyes and a laugh that could light up a room. A local architect, James struck up a conversation about the mural outside the shop, a vibrant splash of colors depicting cityscapes, and somehow, we ended up talking for hours. At first, I was hesitant. Trusting someone new after everything that had happened felt impossible. But James was patient. He didn't push or pry. He simply listened when I wanted to talk and respected my boundaries when I needed space. Over time, our friendship blossomed into something more, a relationship built on mutual respect and understanding. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope again. Hope that maybe, just maybe, love wasn't always toxic. That maybe happiness wasn't out of reach. Ethan's sentencing hearing was a bittersweet moment. As I stood before the court, delivering my victim impact statement, I poured my heart out, not just for myself, but for everyone he'd hurt. I spoke about the lies, the manipulation, the betrayal, and how his actions had shattered lives. My voice trembled, but I refused to let him see me cry. When the judge announced the sentence, 25 years without parole, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Not because I wanted revenge, but because justice mattered. Knowing he couldn't harm anyone else gave me peace. And yet, as I walked out of the courtroom, I realized something important. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. With the legal battle behind me, I turned my focus outward. Volunteering became my therapy. I started working with a local shelter for victims of financial abuse, sharing my story and helping others navigate their own journeys toward healing. Seeing the strength in these women reminded me of how far I'd come and how much farther I still wanted to go. I also decided to write a memoir. At first, it was just a way to process everything I'd been through, but as the words flowed onto the page, I realized it could be more. By publishing my story, I hope to raise awareness about the red flags of abusive relationships, both emotional and financial. To my surprise, the book resonated with readers, landing on bestseller lists and sparking conversations across the country. On a crisp autumn afternoon, I found myself standing at my parents' gravesite, clutching a bouquet of sunflowers, their favorite. It had been years since they passed, but their lesson stayed with me. Resilience, integrity, and the importance of standing up for yourself. I did it, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I faced him, Mom. I faced everything he threw at me, and I'm still standing. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet rustle of leaves and the fading sunlight, I felt a profound sense of closure. Yes, Ethan had stolen pieces of my life, but he hadn't broken me. If anything, he'd forced me to discover a strength I never knew I had. Inspired by the response to my memoir, I founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating women about financial literacy and independence. We hosted workshops, provided resources, and created a support network for survivors of economic exploitation. Watching women transform from victims to victors became my greatest joy. The media dubbed me a champion for change, but honestly, I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because no one should have to endure what I went through alone. Together, we could rewrite the narrative, one woman at a time. 2 years after meeting James, he proposed during a sunset picnic on the beach. There were no grand gestures, no elaborate setups, just him looking into my eyes and asking if I'd spend the rest of my life with him. This time, I said yes without hesitation. Our wedding was intimate, surrounded by close friends and family. Rachel gave a hilarious speech about how far I'd come. Remember when you thought your ex was Prince Charming? And James promised to always support me, no matter where life took us. For the first time, I truly believed in forever. As I stood on the beach that evening, hand in hand with James, I reflected on everything that had brought me here. The pain, the struggle, the victories, they all shaped who I am today. Life isn't perfect, and neither am I. But I've learned to embrace imperfection, to find beauty in the brokenness, and to trust that brighter days lie ahead. Sometimes, people ask me how I move past the betrayal, the heartbreak, the loss. My answer is simple: I didn't move past it. I moved through it. Every step forward, no matter how small, taught me something valuable. About myself, about resilience, about the power of forgiveness, not for others, but for myself. And so, as the waves lapped at my feet and the sky glowed orange and pink, I smiled. Because despite everything, I'd found my happy ending. Not the fairy tale kind, but the real kind, the kind earned through grit, grace, and a whole lot of courage. Sometimes, the hardest battles lead us to the greatest victories and teach us that we are stronger than we ever believed possible.